Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on this session titled Disability and Exchange, a Toolkit for International Exchange Practitioners. This is a really important practical session as we shift from before where many people were asking if it's possible for people with disabilities to participate in exchange programs, but now we're seeing the practitioners really focus on how to do it. So we've got an incredible lineup of panelists today sharing a lot of insight into the resources and tools that you have and that you should equip yourself with to integrate more participants with disabilities in the broad range of international exchange programs. I want to start by introducing the panelists today. We've got David Levin, who's a Senior Program Manager and Diversity Coordinator with the State Department's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. Heidi Soneson, who's the Assistant Vice Chancellor for International Education at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. Cory Owen, who's the Associate Dean of Student Development at the Julliard School. Sue Minder, who's the Director of Accessible Education Services at Willamette University. And Sarah Amin, who's the project manager for International Visitor Leadership Program Department with the Institute of International Education. And I do not want to take more time for myself, so let's go ahead and get started. Joy Lenny, if you want to pull up the slides. And we'll start first with David Levin. David, can you hear us? And he's joining by audio.
I can. Monica, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good, good, good. All right. Of course, there's a little technology glitch. I can't see the slides, but that's okay because I think I know what's on them, so I think we're fine. But I'm happy to be on this panel. Obviously, when we think about disability and inclusion, it's something we've thought about when the clearinghouse was created, and it's been critical ever since. Is we're talking about increasing opportunities for people with disabilities to be on exchange programs. That's not going to happen unless practitioners have the commitment, the interest, the ability, the skills, the resources to make sure that their programs are accessible and they're reaching out to people with disabilities and they're addressing accommodation issues and so on and so forth. So clearly what you do is critical to the whole concept of providing opportunities for people with disabilities to participate in exchange programs. So my view from this standpoint, I think I'm going to give you maybe not the 30,000-foot view, but maybe the 10,000-foot view. I think all of you know the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. Most of you do. We sort of one-stop shopping for international exchange. In the State Department, we have more than 50,000 grantees in a given year with 40,000 programs. So we look at our diversity efforts, and for us, disability is part of that. And you see the ECA diversity statement. That's important to us because it demonstrates we're reaching out to a broad, diverse audience. But the point of that, I think, for all of you is that we see disability as part of diversity, not something that's separate from it. It's a key component within it. And, we look at ways that we serve a disability audience, but we also look at ways that we serve a diverse audience across the board, and in fact, ways that we can, in a sense, marry disability and diversity. From the Bureau standpoint, the next slide, because we've got a staff of 500 people, and because we're working with so many different program agencies and grantee organizations, we looked at ways that we could sort of build an infrastructure of understanding and commitment and resources. So for us, that meant ongoing training for staff, both within the Bureau and with our program agency partners on disability and inclusion. It also meant for us creating an internal practitioners group, because we tend to be siloed and we want to make sure the programs are working with each other and sharing good practices and information. So that group's been in place for 5 years. I think all of you know that we did an Access for All campaign this year for 88 30th as a way of demonstrating the Bureau's commitment to disability and inclusion So these are sort of broader stroke pictures or broader stroke ideas that we've done as a bureau to sort of address what I guess I would call the disability culture. And if you look at the next slide, if you look at what we're doing, we're looking at our exchange program sort of along the exchange continuum or life cycle. That's important for us because it means that it's not simply a diversity focus, it's also diversity and inclusion. And I gave you some examples of how we've been doing that relating to disability within a number of our programs. And I think this is not necessarily new information for you, but maybe just ideas to prompt you in terms of thinking about ways that you can get things accomplished, tips on things you might be doing if you're not doing them. And I guess I should preface all that by saying that our best resource is the clearinghouse. And the point of that is that there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of things going on, lots of good experiences, lots of people with a lot of expertise who can help you do all of this. So the clearinghouse is there for you. We certainly take advantage of it as a bureau and work with the clearinghouse all the time with Monica and her team as we go about our efforts to focus on disability within exchange. But in terms of this cycle, we're looking at things like making sure that we have disability-friendly language in our literature and so forth. Hopefully you're doing that. That's an important first step. We look at things like sort of the next step in terms of going beyond recruitment and outreach, let's say, to the point that you're making selections. We make a point that says disability for us is not considered a selection criteria when we're selecting people. We may know that someone has a disability because maybe they told us that in their application, and that's fine, but we do not use that as a criteria for selection. That's important to us, and I suspect important to you as well. We go beyond that point. We talk about post-selection. We're working with grantees to ensure at this point that they have a successful experience. And how do we lay the foundation for that? Well, in some of our programs, for example, with international visitors, we've designed templates where the visitor can tell us more about themselves, about their disability, about their needs, so we can do the best job that's possible in terms of placing them in locations where they are going to have the most successful experience as possible. Within Fulbright, because it's such a global program and there's so many different players involved, we've developed a protocol that says, how do we go about asking questions about someone's needs, and then how do we go about providing them reasonable accommodations? That's an important tool for us because we want to make sure that we're treating each individual grantee on a case-by-case basis and meeting their specific needs, and make sure that everyone understands the process that we're going through, which includes, as we discuss, needs that obviously includes the grantee themselves. Then we go beyond that, and we look at things like orientation before our grant starts. An example was within our YALI program, Young African Leaders. We've taken our deaf fellows and actually had an orientation program for them at Gallaudet, which has been very useful. So going beyond that, we look at program content, and in this case, with various programs, it's not just programs that are focusing on grantees with disabilities, but there's also focusing on grantees who may not be disabled, but are addressing disability-related studies. And we looked at ways that we can meld programs that may not even have a disability focus to, in fact, make sure that they do have somewhat of a focus that has a disability angle to it. For example, with sports programs, all of our sports programs, regardless of what they're doing, want to make sure that anybody, an athlete, a trainer, a coach who goes through our programs has some exposure to sports relating to people with disabilities. So we've melded those two concepts together. I also would say that in terms of our programming, while we're looking at ways of serving people with disabilities, we're also looking at ways that we can help all of our grantees understand sort of the disability culture and how it relates to American society or societies abroad. So in that example, we do enrichment activities for our visiting Fulbrighters who are here in the United States throughout the year. One of the things we do for all of them is, or most of them if we can, is to give them some exposure to the whole concept of disability. So maybe we'll take them on a site visit to a Gallaudet or to some other entity that demonstrates people with disabilities in society. That's important for all our grantees. If they're going to get an exposure to America, for example, and America's diversity, then for us that also means including exposure to people with disabilities and how they're engaged with their own society. So it's broader than simply serving people with disabilities. It's showing that disability culture and people with disabilities within society. And then we look a little bit further and we get to sort of reentry. And my example there is that MIUSA for many years has provided reentry workshops for our high school students with disabilities before they return home to the former Soviet Union or Muslim majority countries. And then my last point relates to alumni, and we're looking at ways that we can connect disabled alumni in let's say our youth programs with alumni who were in Fulbright, and set up mentor-mentee relationships and build a connection for alumni who come back to the United States or return to their home countries. So we're looking at this throughout sort of the exchange continuum, looking at ways that we can best serve our grantees, but also looking at ways that we can make sure that they are integrated into their grant experiences, and that we're also giving literally all of our grantees some exposure to disability in and of itself. So those are my sort of bigger picture items. I know that my fellow panelists will give you much more specificity about ways they're serving their grantees with disabilities, but I wanted to give you sort of an overview and some bigger picture ideas. So let me turn this back to you, Monica.
Great, thank you so much, David. And now we can go to the next slide and we'll have Heidi. And just as a reminder for attendees, if you want to see the presenter and ASL interpreter in view, you can always go to the top right corner and hit gallery view. We do have the interpreter spotlighted though. And now, Heidi, if you want to join us.
Great, thank you so much. As Monica mentioned, my name is Heidi Soneson. I'm Assistant Vice Chancellor for International Education at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. I'm delighted to be part of this panel. I have appreciated working with all of our colleagues in Mobility International and AHEAD and many other institutions and organizations on international education and inclusivity for students with disabilities. My own expertise stems from a federal grant from the Department of Education in early 2000 to initiate federal national policies for students with disabilities studying abroad, to assist education abroad advisors, university administrators, and to work collaboratively with disability services to really open up the education abroad field for students with disabilities and move to exclusive programming and wide access. Next slide, please. My topic today will focus in three areas. First, principles that we utilize when considering education abroad for students with disabilities. I'll also then look at best advising practices and best outreach opportunities and suggestions, and certainly we'll be happy to answer questions during the Q&A period. When we received the Department of Education grant, which was a 3-year grant, one of the commitments that I had with the co-project director in the University of Minnesota's Office of Disability Services, was to really foster a universal design principle and a collaborative advising strategy. For the universal design principle, the notion is that any accommodation that we implement often has a much broader reach than just the one student. And that is for us a helpful perspective, an essential perspective, and one that has repeatedly proven to be true, that what might be initially a request from an individual student often has broader applicability. We certainly have seen that in the United States in terms of building access, the opportunity to press one of the buttons and be able to have a door open, or have a door open automatically now without having to utilize any door feature, has not only assisted those who might have a mobility disability, but also someone who might be temporarily not able to utilize the function of opening up a door. Could be someone who has had an accident, could be someone who has just the inability at that very time to open the door. And so the universal design really does work to open doors for everyone, figuratively speaking, in so many different ways. It's a principle that comes out of architecture and has been applied quite widely in the United States at institutions of higher education, and is something that works very well when framing up an approach to working with a student with a disability, and also working with your overseas staff or with an overseas institutional colleague to help frame up the value beyond an individual student for the work that we do. A second key principle is designing a collaborative advising strategy. One of the principles that we initiated very early on with the Access Abroad Department of Education grant was that really every individual has the ability to advise a student. You may well have an individual on your campus, both in disability services and in the Education Abroad office, who happens to have additional expertise and be a resource. But the real goal is for everyone to feel comfortable working and advising a student with a disability, and also to know their limits. So an Education Abroad advisor will have expertise in education abroad, does not need to and should not presume to have expertise in appropriate disability accommodations. That's really the role of the Disability Resources Office. And it's important that there is that collaborative approach to advising and overall planning and strategy for the institution, because it really is the tremendous expertise on all sides that allows the student to be best served. This certainly includes knowledge the student has of his or own disability and current ways that the student manages successful educational experiences on campus, as well as the overseas coordinator or organization who is well informed of the realities of that country and what kind of both practical and creative solutions might exist. So the notion of collaboration is extremely important, needs to be done with great intention, including regular meetings, regular visits, regular check-ins, and it really allows the student to also go to various individuals with questions they may have based on their level of comfort. A third principle is to design a transparent process. This has several areas. First of all, to design a transparent process means that it's transparent to the student, that you have information on your website. Perhaps you have a brochure that outlines the steps the student would take, that both you in international education and you in disability services are clear on what the process is, whom to contact. And disability services would equally have some kind of material on their website or in paper that would allow everyone to feel confident how the advising process will proceed to assist the student efficiently, and the advice to give the student regarding timing, access, options, and process. So transparency is key. When I first started with Access Abroad in the early 90s, the typical student would come in and say, do you think there's a program for me? I have a disability. And we have moved now really to seeing students come in and say, I'm excited to go abroad. I have this academic interest and I'd like to follow through with the procedures that are outlined in order to identify which of the 3 programs of interest to me will be a good match. And I'm so delighted to see that level of confidence. And we have worked very hard with institutions internationally and organizations domestically and internationally to really foster that transparent process approach, and it's really been a joy to see the level of confidence that students bring to their interest in studying abroad. As I mentioned, it's essential to integrate all advisors at all levels. So whether it's a front desk advisor, a student worker, someone in disability services, someone in education abroad, also your academic advisors, really taking the opportunity to do some basic training and some collaboration to say, how will we all work together? Let's come up with 3 principles that we'll all utilize. And here's when you contact this person and when you contact that person and when do you refer on. That really allows everyone to feel confident and allows the student to be serviced most effectively without having to wait for a supposed expert. So I really encourage a holistic approach. Finally, there are obviously legal considerations that are important to keep in mind. Those are best addressed with your legal counsel, your risk management director, to think through for your institution, what are the parameters. There is a lot of change happening, a much greater inclusivity than before, including mental health conditions, and physical health conditions that qualify now. And so disability services will also be an excellent resource in determining who funds a particular accommodation. Is it the student? Is it the institution? Does the Disability Services Office have a fund that they utilize for on-campus services that they can utilize for the needs of the student abroad? There are a number of really critical questions that help provide confidence to all advisors if those are established in advance. Next slide, please. So when it comes to advising students with disabilities for education abroad, I'm sure you'll hear some of the same themes from my colleagues. The first piece is to recognize the individual student. This may seem obvious, but part of the emphasis here is to focus first on their academic needs, on their geographical interests, the time that they wish to study abroad. The disability, while an essential component of the conversation, should not be the focus. There are so many different options right now that it's really not where anyone should start. And I often, if a student says, you know, I have this disability, where can I go? I will often back that student up and ask some of the same questions I ask of all students. What is your major? Do you have any geographical interests? What is the time that you would like to study abroad? One of the questions that still occasionally arises is, which program is best for my particular disability accommodation need? My response consistently is any program has the potential to be accessible. And that's why I start in a different place than focusing on the disability. Now, not every program can accommodate every disability accommodation request, but it is best not to divide programs out into any particular categories before you know the individual student. The same is really true for the disability accommodation request. Every student is unique. Every disability accommodation is unique. I have had students with same, quote, same disability accommodation need on a program, and they have had two completely different experiences and two completely different levels of support. So it's very important that the emphasis is on the individual. There can be certainly broad guidelines that I will talk about in the next slide to help create broad categories of understanding about accessibility at particular sites, but each student will be unique in that process. And it's important to really allow for the dialogue to focus on that individuality. We encourage students to consider multiple choices. Again, so much is part of the dialogue. A student may have a mobility impairment, and the initial approach might be, well, there are no laws in that country to actually provide for mobility access. There are no curb cuts, so that's not possible. But then again, a country might have tremendous flexibility, and the student might be equally flexible, so that there are options on how a student might achieve access to that site, even if it's not a country that has a lot of formal legislation. Other countries that have formal legislation may be quite restrictive, so that they really can't be flexible and creative in their problem solving because they must follow the legal guidelines. And so it's, I always encourage students to have ideally 3 choices so that I can inquire with 3 different providers or programs abroad to see which one has options for our student, and then in the dialogue with the student disability services, select from those options to see which seems like the best fit for the student. One critical piece is an accommodation request form. There are many different examples of these forms available. Sue Minder, who will be speaking next, and I just published a publication through NAFSA that is available that includes links to accommodation forms that have been designed by various institutions and organizations. This form allows a student to work with disability services to identify the needs on campus that a student would have and to project out the needs that a student would have abroad. The benefit of this is that it is something that the student can then utilize in reflection with the Disability Resource Center advisor to then provide to you as a starting point for the discussion. I find it very important to include the disability services access consultant in that process because they really have a broader perspective. They've often worked with that student on on-campus needs and can provide some very helpful information that will ground the conversation in guidelines that are used regularly through the Disability Resources Office. As David mentioned, the question regarding a student's accommodations needs should not be part of the application process. It should not be part of a selection criteria. That does not mean that the conversation has to wait until the student is accepted. The earlier a student begins the dialogue with the Disability Resources Access Consultant and the Education Abroad Advisor, the better. Typically, we say we need 8 weeks notice for accommodations. Now, I have to admit, I have done it on 2 weeks notice, thinking it was nothing is possible, and it worked out absolutely fine due to the creative collaboration of all parties, including the students. So 8 weeks is good, a year if it's possible, if it's a more complex request that involves access to particular housing and particular transportation. Certainly 8 weeks is considered a minimum. That conversation can begin at any time, but it should not be a question that is asked as part of the application process. And if you are aware of a student having a need and applying to a program you do not think has the access, you should still allow the application process to continue and then address the question of accommodation in the post-application stage. That's why I encourage 3 choices. Often, if I do that early with the student, by the time the student applies, they are applying to a program they know has access. And of course, every student also wishes to go to a program where they will actually be able to have a robust educational and access experience. So the earlier the better, and hopefully by the time of the application process, the student is applying to a program that will be able to provide the accommodation. The final piece I'll mention under advising is the importance of documenting next steps. This can be done in several ways. You can have something on your website that documents the next steps after application. Are there resources through Mobility International that a student can begin to explore? To clarify that once you've received information back from the overseas site, you will provide that to the student and to the Disability Resources Access Consultant in an email so that it's in writing. You will also want to clarify who at the hosting organization or at the overseas site will be the student's contact. Often it's easy to focus on sorting out the accommodation need and not facilitating the next steps so that the student is both prepared for the experience and has a clear contact, because often additional needs come up afterwards, or a student might have put a tremendous amount in place and in fact there is not the significant level of need or the number of accommodations, and that would also be considered, and then changes would be made. A mobility transport vehicle might not be needed because public transportation is very good, and then that could be canceled. So making sure these things are in writing via email, making sure that the overseas staff are clear what the accommodations are and reach out to the student and provide that next steps contact really facilitates the entire process and helps avoid misunderstandings or confusions. Next slide, please. Finally, what I'd like to focus on is outreach. David alluded to this. I think it is so important for us to continue the language that we have an inclusive philosophy when it comes to access. The more students disclose, the better prepared we all can be with the student for their experience. We have seen through IIE's statistics that they're through Open Doors, the greater number of students with disabilities studying abroad. I would argue that's in part the fact that we are more open and more clearly and visibly inviting. And also, I think it is simply that students are disclosing what they did not disclose before and simply figured out how to do on their own or struggled when they were abroad. So inviting disclosure serves everyone well, because we can then help prepare the student and the overseas site and provide opportunities for students, for this particular student and for future students, in ways that we did not even know we had available to us. So inviting disclosure is important. This can be done on your website. This in several ways. You can have information about your own programs and general access to those programs, attitudinal, physical, classroom, housing, public transportation. Public transportation for here may or may not be accessible, but many European countries, for example, have thought about this in advance, and much of their public transportation is already accessible, and that's something a student might not know. So general information on your programs is helpful. In addition, I would say inviting disclosure through your materials, having a separate brochure for students with disabilities, just as you might for students of color or GLBTQ. Something that says to the student, we see you, we know you, we recognize you, and we would like you to come and talk with us, is very important. Having general information on your website. Many of our providers that we use in education abroad are already doing this, and you'd be able to link to that. Otherwise, you might have just general considerations. Here are things to do. Be sure you contact us 8 weeks in advance. Definitely come in, talk to your Disability Resources Access Consultant as soon as possible. Things that help a student know how to begin the process. The transparent advising process is something I've discussed already in part. Again, clarifying for the student, both through your website and in person, here are the steps we'll be taking. First, you'll talk with your Disability Accommodations Resources Advisor, talk through the accommodation form, then I'll respond, we can meet. Helping the student really see the full picture gives the student confidence and also really helps the planning. Collaboration with disability services, as I mentioned, is something very helpful. I encourage education abroad offices to have the link to disability resources on their webpage, so that it is an easy link for a student to be able to circle out to their disability resources access consultant, vice versa. And then, if possible, feature some student stories. These student stories that you might have of study abroad students in general, and to include students with disabilities, really can help students understand. It might say, it was really great that I talked to education abroad early on because then I could plan, or here are the challenges and how I overcome them. Those kinds of student to student messages are often, as we know very regularly from reviews of our programs, the student to student stories are often the most effective. So I hope that's helpful as a beginning conversation, and I will turn it now over to Sue Minder. We look forward to the remaining presenters, and will be available for Q&A at the end. Thank you, Monica.
Hi, everyone. I am also delighted to be on this panel. I'm Sue Minder, pronounced with a long I, but everybody does that, so it's okay. And I'm the Director of Accessible Education Services at Willamette University. My interest in supporting education abroad opportunities for students really came out of initially working as a senior access consultant at the University of Minnesota and being the liaison between disability resources and education abroad office. So I have almost a decade of experience now, which is kind of scary that I'm more than a decade actually, that I'm getting that old, but of supporting international students with disabilities, both incoming to the US, to US institutions, and then outgoing. One of my slides is missing, so I will be recreating that so that it will be on the website and available for you as a resource after this presentation. And of course, I'm happy to answer questions. So the slide that is missing is supporting international students and approaching accommodations. So Heidi mentioned that our publication, Education Abroad Advising for Students with Disabilities, something that we co-authored for NAFSA. And in that publication, you'll see a lot of types of disabilities, as well as some typical quote unquote accommodations that may provide access for this certain disability type. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of that here because that publication is available. What I do want to focus on is as you approach and think about accommodations and assess accommodation capacity, David has discussed this a little bit, the social justice and diversity model of disability. So what does that mean? What are some concrete things to keep in mind as you operate from a social justice and diversity model of disability? And this is a work in progress for everyone, I'm sure. We know that as a nation that the ADA was passed 30 years ago, and that as a nation we are still shaping and crafting what disability justice for Americans with disabilities looks like. So we are still shaping what that means for our nation and nations globally, and how we are going to, as a society, include people with disabilities. But the key to the social justice and diversity model is that the focus as you approach accommodations needs to be on the environment. How can we modify the environment or adjust the environment to provide access? This is not how disability has always been thought of historically. Historically, disability has been thought of as from more of a medical model, or sometimes you'll hear it called the rehab model. So that the person with the disability is what needs to be fixed, we need to, or cured, we need to have this person overcome their disability so that they can participate or function in society. That way of thinking has shifted and is still shifting to how do we change the environment to provide access and include students with disabilities, people with disabilities. The second thing that's really important about the social justice and diversity model of disability is intersectionality. So when we think about disability, students with disabilities or people with disabilities intersect across all races, other identities, GLBTQ, non-gender binary, are also people with disabilities. And so assume that, I always tell people, whenever you go anywhere or whenever you attend a virtual event, as it is these days, assume that there are people with disabilities in the room who also encompass and identify with other identities. The third point I'll make about social justice and diversity models of disability is really specific to department and office names. So for instance, in higher ed, all of our access offices used to be referred to as disability services. That was quite universal. And the focus in that kind of a name is service. Again, coming from that rehab model, we are serving people with disabilities. That has really shifted to now you'll see very commonly disability resources, the Disability Resource Center. Sometimes you'll see the name access or accessibility in campus access offices, but the focus has really shifted to be, we are a resource for students with disabilities, or we are here to, we are here to provide access. And also that we are here as a campus resource on accessibility to a campus resource for faculty, administrators, staff, and other relevant stakeholders. And then as you approach accommodations from a social justice and diversity model of disability, because you have it all down now, right? You've completely changed your minds. There are 4 arenas of what I always like to think about as meaningful access. So we've talked about, Heidi has talked about them briefly. The physical environment, is the physical space accessible? We always sort of think about wheelchair access, but are there other forms of access? Are there Braille signs? Are there people available to provide verbal directions? If you have the resources, do you have a tactile map available? Have you considered an accessible digital map that describes everything in a text format rather than pictures? Do you have multiple ways of conveying information? That's really more information. So the information environment is conveying information in multiple ways. As we are doing this morning, we have slides. You have access to a transcript, and there's a list of resources at the end in digital format, and a PDF, I believe, document of this presentation. The third arena of meaningful access really is focusing on program and policy. So as you're shaping your programs and policies of how to serve people with disabilities, or how to be a resource for students with disabilities and people with disabilities, are you forming your policies which are inclusive of people with disabilities, or would unintentionally screen someone with a disability out? An example of this would be often when I'm looking at job requirements, for instance, when I'm looking at job descriptions, it will say driver's license required. So is a driver's license really required, or is it travel is required? So as you're framing and forming the wording around your policies and your programs, that is one example, but there are a number of ways that you can make your policies and your programs inclusive of students with disabilities and people with disabilities. And then the final arena of meaningful access is attitudinal. That really goes back to the shift we have made from thinking about serving people with disabilities and that rehab model of the disability needs to be cured or fixed to disability is a valuable aspect of human diversity. Disability enriches our society. And so we need to approach accommodations and shape how we craft assessing capacity of inclusion of students and people with disabilities needs to come from that framework, and that's an attitudinal shift. So now we will go to the next slide, supporting international students, considerations for accommodations. So as you're supporting international students, once you have gone through the process of hopefully getting an accommodation request form, we have divided our publication into cross-campus and overseas collaborations, and this would apply for both incoming and outgoing education abroad opportunities for students with disabilities. We also discuss types of disabilities and accommodations, and then pre-departure and on-site advising. So as you're thinking about all of those three areas, you'll want to, again, go back to Heidi's point about taking the individual student, thinking of assessing not just their disability, but their academics. So classroom, what are going to be the needs in the classroom? There's it's really sometimes, I think there's dangers in toolkits because as we have these toolkits and helpful ways of thinking about access, there is, I think, a tendency in all of us to go, okay, so this person is deaf, and so we're going to provide access this way. So it's really important as you access resources on disabilities to be helpful, that you not get into the habit of sort of pigeonholing or assuming that because a person has one type of disability that this kind of an accommodation is going to work. An example of that is I worked with a student who is blind who came into the University of Minnesota as from Brazil to study and major in computer science engineering. One of the very common ways to provide alternate formats to students who are blind is electronic. Had I not explored what the student's major is and what the informational needs are, then and just assumed that electronic formats were going to work, it would have been a complete disaster, because in computer science and engineering, there are a lot of charts and graphs. Math is really a language that's conveyed visually, and so the information really needed to be provided in Braille. So that's just one example of how you may be familiar with a disability, you may think you know what's going to provide access in the classroom, but deeper exploration and excavation is needed to really understand that person's individual academic pursuits. Residential is the next thing that you will want to consider when you're, again, assessing capacity for providing accommodations at your institution for someone incoming or assessing capacity and as you collaborate with overseas coordinators and staff about, is this going to be accessible for a student who's outgoing? So this same student who came in and studied at the University of Minnesota, majored in computer science and engineering, also engaged in education abroad away from the University of Minnesota while he was at the University of Minnesota. So residential and navigation, transportation, extracurricular and social, and expeditions and field trips, these are all going to be aspects that are important to anyone's education abroad experience. And so as you assess your capacity with the student and with all the key stakeholders involved, these are the arenas you want to think about. So Heidi and I collaborated with a number of other Disability Resource Center staff at the University of Minnesota on accommodations for a deaf student who was going to study abroad, and we had the resources to provide a high level of access, and so we sent, I believe it was 2 or 3 interpreters, ASL interpreters, along with the student. But one of the things that we did was clearly delineate, we will provide ASL interpreting for these activities, but there are times where you are going to be on your own. So thinking about residential, we're not going to provide an ASL interpreter in your residence with your roommate 24 hours a day. You may not have access to an ASL interpreter during the extracurricular and social. So if you want to go out with your friends to a bar or a club, you may not, that more than likely will not be available. So those are some ways to think about how are we going to provide access in these different arenas, in these different areas that make up an education abroad experience. I'm going to briefly touch on dietary and service animals and emotional support animals, because those are more complex, can be more complex accommodations. So dietary accommodations, it's going to be very important if a student asks about dietary accommodations. It's going to be very important that you understand what the need is, assuming that the person is requesting a dietary accommodation for a food allergy or allergies. You'll want to really unpack with the student what is the allergy, what are the severity of your reactions, and also make sure that you have clear documentation from their medical provider, and make sure that the documentation, the person who provides the documentation, that it is within their scope of practice to provide. What I mean by that is there are a lot of health and wellness sort of acupuncturists and chiropractors, and I'm not saying that there is not value in those kinds of practitioners, but if an acupuncturist or a chiropractor is diagnosing a food allergy, you may want to ask the student to sign a release of information so that you can get more information about what's actually going on. And the reason I say that is because as you're assessing something like a dietary accommodation abroad, you will need to, with your institution's legal counsel and the overseas coordinator, and really excavate what's reasonable to provide, what can we provide, and what can we say we can provide so that the students' health and safety are not in jeopardy, and so that they're aware of what they're going to be working with and dealing with as they engage in their education abroad experience. Service animals and emotional support animals. We devoted an entire section in our publication to this because it is one of the most challenging areas for students with disabilities to navigate if they do have a service animal or an emotional support animal. So my first point is going to be that service animals are in the US, they are an absolute right, and they can 99% of the time only be dogs. There have been rare instances where miniature horses have been approved as service animals, but it's definitely not typical. So what do I mean by an absolute right? I mean that in the US, students and people who use a service animal have the right to take them any public place. They do not have to verify or provide documentation of disability or certification of training. And institutions are, and public institutions, state institutions, we are limited to 2 questions, and those are, is this animal required because of a disability, and what work or task is it trained to perform? Service animals are regulated and protected by the ADA and the Department of Justice. Emotional support animals are not confined to being dogs. There is no legislation restricting the species of emotional support animals, and emotional support animals are a Fair Housing Act regulation, and they are protected by the by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So those are very 2 important distinctions, because emotional support animals have not been, they're not protected in the sense that you can take them everywhere, that people with disabilities can take them everywhere. So in the context of studying abroad, and for students pursuing an education abroad opportunity, if they feel that they need to travel with a service animal or an emotional support animal, that it would require at least a year of planning in advance. Some resources that you'll want to look at, which are in our publication, are the Air Carrier Access Act. How is this person going to travel with the service animal or emotional support animal? You will also need to be acquainted with the overseas sites, regulations, and laws on service animals and emotional support animals, if there are even protections for service animals and emotional support animals, and what are the vaccination and licensing requirements in that country. And that's research that I strongly recommend any of you who are advising a student with a disability who wants to study abroad with a service or an emotional support animal, or if you're if you're advising someone coming in with, you still will want to know what vaccinations have been provided. Is this animal up to date on their vaccinations by US standards? So it works both ways, and it is something that a year at least, and I call that a minimum when you're thinking about this accommodation. A year and a half to 2 would be better. And for some overseas sites, depending upon what the laws and protections are, bringing an animal may not be feasible, and so working out alternatives with the student when possible. An example of one is that I worked with a student who was going to be studying abroad in England and wanted to bring their emotional support animal. And we did a lot of unpacking and exploring of what is the need, what symptoms does the animal reduce for you, and then are there other ways that you can engage in the therapeutic aspect of having an animal. And we came up with her being able to make regular visits to animal shelters. So sometimes an alternative is possible and necessary as well.
Hey Sue, this is Monica. I just want to do a time check that we're 5 past the hour and have 2 more panelists. to present.
Okay, yep. So I'm just going to, if we move to the next slide, I'm going to talk really briefly about the main types of disabilities that we feature in our publication. This is not an exhaustive list, and you may have seen them outlined in different ways, but this will help you as you think about the type of disability and then the accommodations that will work, which it makes up an entire section of our publication. But as you're thinking about the student holistically, and we're talking about access and access abroad, understanding the disability and what the barriers are is very important. So blind, low vision, deaf or hard of hearing, neurodiverse and learning disabilities, mental health disabilities, physical disabilities, and systemic and chronic health disabilities. I'm going to leave it there because of the time constraints, but I'll be available for questions after the presentation. Thank you, Monica.
Great, thank you so much, Sue.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cory Owen. I'm the Associate Dean of Student Development at the Julliard School in New York City. And I work with international students primarily. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the role of an international student and scholar advisor and what it looks like to really find ways to welcome international students with disabilities. So there's a couple things that I think are really important for us to think about from the start. And this is thinking about a holistic advising model from before they enter the US. And so thinking about systemic ways that our offices and our materials are accessible. If you've never used a screen reader, I really recommend you can find free ones online to download so that you can even test out what your materials sound like by using a tool like this. And it really helps you find blind spots in areas where you think maybe your materials or your websites are accessible, but they in fact may not be. I think thinking about font types is really, really important. For international student advisors, that's important also for our non-native English speakers who may really need very clear fonts to take into consideration. But beyond that, thinking about, do you use a serif or a sans serif font? And what does that look like for a student who may be dyslexic? Color combinations really make a big difference as well for students who may be colorblind, and what does that look like when you're trying to do marketing materials? I think nowadays, especially with COVID, we're doing a lot of things online and digitally, and so we're always trying to find splashy ways to make our materials very engaging, but we want to ensure that that's not at the expense of readability. So thinking through what that looks like for someone that may have difficulty seeing color differences. Thinking about audio. So I know in my laptop, for example, I have the capability of having auto captioning done during my presentations, and that has been incredibly helpful. So if you have that functionality, that's great. Often in Microsoft PowerPoint or Google Slides, you can also integrate that service in there. For those of us that use Zoom for a lot of our meetings, some campuses have purchased the closed captioning modules that allow for it. And some campuses do not have that yet. And so taking into consideration what that looks like for engaging with our students and making sure that the materials are really as accessible as possible. And then remembering to use alt text. So when you receive these slides, you should be able to hover over this image. So on this slide, you'll see a picture of the cover of our book. This is a book called Advising International Students with Disabilities. And when you hover over that, that alt text will tell you not only what the image is, but kind of give you a descriptor so that you can understand the context of what is seen on that screen. And that really helps students who may have a visual impairment or are blind understand what is going on the screen. One of the things that I think is really important and critical for international students in cross-cultural communication is destigmatizing help seeking. Some of our students are going to be coming from countries or cultures where help-seeking behaviors are really stigmatized or looked down upon, or they may be coming from countries and cultures where disabilities are not talked about or they're seen as shameful. And so making sure that we take our role seriously and introducing things like resources and accessibility tools on campuses in a way that really has them integrate into the campus and not have them be afraid or ashamed of asking for help or asking for any kind of support. One way that I like to do that is including international students who feel comfortable sharing their own accommodation plan with our international students during our international student orientation. And the last thing is taking into consideration things like the use of microphones or closed captioning. I talked about closed captioning before, but when we're in person, I think so often we forget how important it is to use a microphone. I don't know about you, but I've been in many conferences or large group settings where someone says, "Can you hear me in the back?" And it can be really awkward because there may be folks in the audience that cannot hear, but don't feel comfortable saying, "Oh, I need you to mic up." So remembering using the microphone and making that the default setting for any type of large group conversation will really help those who may have a hard time hearing. So you move to the next slide. I want to also touch a little bit about pre-arrival preparations. So when we're thinking about students and having them prepare for life in the US, one of the things that comes up is making sure that they're aware of what it looks like on your campus and in your city or in your county or your state. Because what they may be used to, what accommodations they have, may not fit what they're going to be moving into in your place. So I think a lot about if you've never been to your city before, what would you like to know? What are the things that are really helpful? So I know right now I live in New York City. So most of our students do not own a car. So I have to think about how do I convey to our students what it's like to rely on public transportation? How do I convey to my students how to identify where elevators or escalators are in the different ways to approach the subway? Because they're not always available, right? So thinking about service animals, I think Sue did a phenomenal job talking about this. One of the things that's really pertinent to think about is not only what are the support animal or service animal policies for your own campus and how is that going to be integrated every day, but also are there quarantine requirements at the airport? Based on what country they're coming from, there may be specific requirements for that. In some cities, there are laws about certain breeds of dogs. Now the ADA trumps that. However, do we prepare our students to understand that if they have a dog breed that is their service animal that is typically not allowed in that city, how do we prepare them to answer questions about that? Right? So having that conversation ahead of time before they even get on the plane to enter this country. Many campuses offer airport pickup programs, which is a phenomenal resource. However, are we taking into consideration what it looks like for a student who may have a certain accommodation needs? So if a student is coming in, and I know that often in airport pickup programs, folks will hold up signs saying, welcome to our institution, they'll have the name. Well, if someone is blind or visually impaired, that's not going to be helpful. If someone has a mobility limitation, if they have a wheelchair or a scooter, a small car is probably not going to work. So are we taking that into consideration as we're setting our pickup programs? And then thinking about how students can prepare before they start classes. So if they have certain medications they need to bring into the US, have they thought about what the prescriptions look like? Have they thought about when their prescription will end and then transitioning over to the US health insurance program and what that looks like? The voltage requirements, I think that's really a thing that doesn't come up often. If you have a motorized scooter or motorized wheelchair and those have to be plugged in or charged, what are the voltage requirements from the country they're coming from and in your country, the US? When I say wheelchair considerations and weather considerations, I'm thinking about students that may be coming from very typically warm places, and let's say your campus has very severe winters. Are they prepared for their tires to go on ice and snow? I know that we've had students whose wheelchairs or scooters have been stuck in the ice or in the snowbanks, and they have to have strangers help them out. And so what are we thinking? How are you preparing them for that? And then, of course, reminding students about accommodation request timelines. I think particularly for students that live in the residence hall, making sure they're thinking ahead of time of putting in the request as early as possible, because our offices of residence life often have to have, the accommodation set first before they start assigning other rooms. But if they're getting those requests later on in the summer, then perhaps some of the rooms with, the showers that are more accessible or the single rooms are already committed to other students. And then our international students are scrambling at the last minute to ensure that their living space is welcoming and inclusive. And the final thing is making sure that we are continually educating ourselves and others. there's a three-prong approach that I think that falls into how we do this. So training our own ISSS staff, so international students and scholar staff, making sure that we ourselves are being trained by disability support services or access programs and counseling services to ensure we know what best practices there are, how we can best support our students. One thing I always recommend is having a walkthrough of your physical space. Is there enough clearance for someone that uses a wheelchair or a scooter to actually get to your office? What is your desk height like? Do you have, stimming tools for some students that may be in your office and may need something like that? What kind of activities can you do to ensure that you are including your students and making sure that they are not feeling marginalized or not feeling called out or singled out? So making sure that all your staff members, including your front desk staff, are prepared for that. And especially if you are hiring student staff to help with, some of the office flow, ensuring they're receiving that same type of training. I think this is also a really good opportunity to have that dialogue back and forth where we as ISSS staff can report back to our other colleagues and talk about what cross-cultural considerations may need to play a role in how we communicate. So I think that's a really good opportunity for us to help kind of communicate, well, these are some general trends we see in these countries or cultures. And these are some maybe words that we use to help destigmatize help-seeking behaviors. So that training can go both ways. I think another way of doing that is also including some of these partners to your international student orientation. So bringing in perhaps either students or folks from the disability support services or counseling services that can talk about services in a very destigmatizing way and use, opportunities like that to introduce folks to services that are available, talk about privacy and confidentiality. I know for me, one of the biggest things I hear a lot are concerns, well, I don't want my family to find out. I don't want my parents to find out that I'm accessing these resources. And so ensuring that in the US, what HIPAA covers, what FERPA covers, I think that's all part of international student orientation, but we can be very specific about this. And again, if you have current international students that are taking advantage of these services, involving them, if they feel comfortable in sharing their own journey, really helps kind of open up the dialogue and help students, approach these services in ways that maybe they wouldn't have if it were just you or I having a conversation about it. All right. And I think that was my last slide. I want to be mindful of time. Yes.
Thank you so much, Cory.
Hi, everyone. This is Amin here, and I'm with the Institute of International Education, where I work on the Department of State's International Visitor Leadership Program, or IVLP. In the interest of time, I'm going to go over some of the highlights of the logistics of inbound professional exchanges. Typically, for those of you who don't know, the IVLP is a short-term inbound professional exchange program that invites nearly 5,000 visitors each year from every region of the world to meet their counterparts in the US. My colleagues on this panel spoke about various aspects of inclusive exchange, including the role of the ECA and support for students at academic institutions. I will focus a little bit more closely on the logistical nuts and bolts of inbound exchange programs outside of academic exchange. Although some of our concerns are similar as the other panelists, I will emphasize accommodations in the context of pre-planning and building strong partnerships with resources in the local host community. As this is a very broad topic and we have limited time, I will offer a brief snapshot, but I'm happy to connect with anybody offline afterwards if you have any specific questions. So as David mentioned, ECA's Access for All campaign is committed to improving accessibility and inclusion of people with disabilities in all programs, and these efforts are included in the recruitment stage as well. However, when an implementing organization does not play a role in the recruitment process, as is the case with IVLP implementers, they can instead position themselves as the leaders and promoters of inclusive exchange by arming themselves with the right tools, business relationships, and messaging in their outreach. This process has to begin with website accessibility and scrutinizing the language and images that are used in promotional materials to ensure that the organization showcases a disability affirmative stance. Far in advance of any program where you anticipate participants with disabilities, you want to be in the information gathering mode first. You want to begin by surveying the participants' accommodation needs through tailored information forms. As template examples, I would point you to MyUSA's assessment forms available on their website and also on the last slide of this presentation at the end. They provide individual surveys tailored to a variety of disabilities to gather information. As the implementing or host organization, it's very important at this stage to shorten the chain of communication, if possible, so that accommodation requests come directly from the participants and do not get lost in translation. I had a challenge several years ago where I was working with a participant from Japan whose accommodation requests were mistranslated from Japanese to English or misunderstood entirely because several people in the chain of communication were not familiar with the medical terminology or the technology that she needed. In that case, it would have been preferable if I was able to speak directly to her to understand her access needs in the US. Finally, once you have assessed the participants' needs, you will need to follow appropriate protocols in your organization to reach out to trusted vendors and service providers to assess the overall budget requirements. Next slide, please. It is much easier to accomplish this when you have done your research early on and already established strong business partnerships in your local community. How do we go about that? Where do you start to learn about access in the community where your participant will travel? You can start by collaborating with those who already work in this area so that you don't need to reinvent the wheel. If you are partnering with an organization in a host city that has hosted exchange participants with disabilities, ask them first because they will know their community resources. Also, many communities will have a Center for Independent Living, which is a consumer-controlled community-based cross-disability agency operated by people with disabilities to provide independent living services. These centers would be a great resource to learn more about access services in that community. I would also point to the work of my fellow panelists. Disability support services at colleges and universities have a wealth of information on assistive and adaptive technology and ways to get around town. They will be familiar with navigating independent living both on and off campus. Finally, local disability advocacy organizations will most certainly have contacts within the local disability community who can guide you. Next slide, please. Now, when I say resources, I know both Sue and Cory have covered a lot of ground on these for students, but I'm also referring to all the elements that make a program go. This is by no means an exhaustive list. There are multiple other considerations. This is just a list of examples. These may include services such as transportation, lodging, interpretation services, medical equipment providers, healthcare providers, access to food and cultural activities. In every instance, it's important to vet the businesses with which you partner by explaining the nature of the exchange program, the expectation of the participants, and that you wish to form a long-term tailored partnership with them to ensure smooth transactions and positive experiences for future participants with disabilities. For example, for a short-term exchange, you may want to seek a hotel or short-term housing. In that case, you will want to tour the accommodation with an on-site manager or building engineer with a comprehensive accessibility checklist to personally ensure that accommodation needs are understood and met for all types of disabilities. And the same goes for ground transportation. When you are completing the procurement process within your organization, you want to make sure that for people who are wheelchair users, a motorized wheelchair or manual chairs, you want to make sure that the driver of the ground transportation is fully trained and understands proper tie-down methods and what the local laws are. We found that there are certain transportation companies that are not fully knowledgeable about this. So on this slide, I've included a photo of a wind-up toy with a key. I chose to conclude the presentation with this image because I use it as a personal reminder that the best we can do is to prepare in advance for accessibility. I view preparation as the act of winding the key on a toy. Once the key is released, you take a deep breath and let the program run its course with the hope that it runs as you planned. There will be challenges and unforeseen hiccups in each case, but it's good to view these as opportunities to learn instead of mistakes so that we can continue to strive for excellence in future programming. And that concludes my presentation, so I'll hand it back to Monica.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, and that's a great analogy. Did anybody want to review, well, I guess I can share some of these resources you have up. There's the publication from Sue and Heidi, the NAFSA publication, Education Abroad, Advising to Students with Disabilities. I've also included this in the chat box, the direct link, as well as the publication from Cory Owen on advising international students with disabilities. We will be sharing these slides so you can access the direct links and the whole PowerPoint presentation after this webinar. And of course, our clearinghouse URL, so you can also access a number of tip sheets and resources on ESA and travel with service animals that Sue spoke about. And also, Sarah, did you want to talk about maybe how you've used our Knowing What Disability Questions to Ask resource?
Sure. So I believe that ECA, or the Office of International Visitors, has worked with MyUSA to develop, to take the template that you have on your website and tailor it to the IVLP program. And the State Department then sends it off to the U.S. Embassy to gather information from participants. So it has worked as, the forms have worked as a really good guide for us to gather information pre-program.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. And I know we've got, I want to at least share one question. We've been answering many questions through the Q&A box, so if you have not already seen those have been being answered publicly, so you can see some of those Q&As. But maybe one question to end on is, I have a question, but may not be as relevant. Let me see, hold on. I now work on the U.S. Speaker Program at the Department of State. Through our program, Americans share their expertise in various fields with international audiences. Do any of the speakers have advice for exchange programs on how to recruit more Americans with disabilities who have expertise in various areas, such as science, technology, politics, etc.? Yeah, no, not sure, Sarah, if you have any experience with this one. If for the IVLP programs, or even David, I think you're on the call on reaching out to more Americans with disabilities and those specific expertise.
I can say a few words about this, Monica.
Great.
So I think that you know, certainly within ECA, you know, because of the fact that our exchange programs as a group are very comprehensive, you know, we both the Bureau and our partners are looking at different audiences as we do recruitment. So that's everything from working with some you know, sort of major national organizations, American Association of People with Disabilities, or working with different organizations that are more specifically focusing on, you know, certain types of disabilities, American Foundation for the Blind, you know, the National Association for the Deaf. There are a range of organizations that are serving different disabilities. And I think more specifically, in terms of the question I think there are lots of organizations that, you know, are serving their membership, which include people with disabilities. For example, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, you know, has a I won't say an office, but certainly a service that specifically reaches out to its membership with people with disabilities. Or I can think of you know, other professional organizations, you know, whether it's journalists, whether it's lawyers. There's so many different organizations that are serving people with disabilities in professional fields. And I think even if you look at more specifically within different locations, virtually every city has a disability office as part of the mayor's office. So there's ways of reaching out to people in different locations. You know, we always talk about the fact that people with disabilities, you know, are in every society, you know, living their lives, working with families, all that you can imagine. So they're part of the fabric of society. So I think that you know, it's not at all uncommon to look at various kinds of organizations that you're reaching out to and simply ask the question, you know, are you serving your audience, does that include people with disabilities? And just the way that the speakers program might reach out to somebody in any field that could simply ask that disability question.
Mm-hmm. Great. That's a great response, David. Thank you so much. I know we're just hit for time right now, and we did have some Q&As coming in, and just to let you know that we'll document all the questions and answers that also have to relate to funding, which is always a big question for many providers and programs as they're making accommodations for people with disabilities and exchange programs. So we'll collect those Q&As, those responses, and be able to post them on our website after this recording. And just for a schedule for the rest of the day, we've got from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, Innovation and Impact. Our new clearinghouse launched the Access to Exchange externships, so we'll be hearing from our externs and about their outreach activities. And then we'll have our official closing from 3:30 to 4:30 Eastern Time with 2 guest speakers as well. So cannot believe that this is the last day of joining hands, but yeah, I hope you can enjoy, join us for the rest of the activities. And to end, I'd like to bring up the presenters on video so we can capture a photo of all the panelists. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Alert visual now started.